All right, everybody. My name is Kimberly Ernest. I am a licensed professional counselor and a licensed psychologist here in the state of Pennsylvania. And today I am going to talk to you a little bit about the concept of feedback-informed treatment, which is an evidence-based practice that we utilize here at PCS in our outpatient system. Feedback-informed treatment is essentially just a systematic sort of checking in with and getting feedback from the client about their perceptions regarding both the therapeutic process, progress, and then the therapeutic process of connection between clinician and client. And sort of it's designed, or sort of the intention behind it, is to increase clinical effectiveness of your intervention as well as improve the therapeutic relationship. But basically, it's all designed to be intentional connections. My own fit experience. So I worked, or part of my training was at the University of North Texas. That's where I received my doctorate in clinical psychology. And at the University of North Texas, we had a training clinic where we would record all of our sessions and get a lot of feedback from supervisors and our peers about our own clinical process to improve our clinical skill. It was a wonderful training experience, but a large component of that as well was daily assessment. So at the beginning of every session with a client, they would fill out what was the clinical outcomes questionnaire, the OQ, and that would have them sort of rate their symptomology and give some feedback on how they have perceived their progress in therapy to be. And then they would also complete a measure of the therapeutic relationship, the therapeutic alliance inventory. So that would give a little bit of information to you as a clinician about whether or not it was really feeling like the client was connected and sort of engaged in the therapeutic relationship. Then after that, for part of my training, I was a doctoral intern at the VA, in Dallas, Texas. A big part of that training is to get very well trained in the treatment of trauma, which probably isn't a huge surprise to anyone. But clinicians within the VA system have to work with a lot of trauma, specifically, most likely combat trauma. Although we do have a variety of other sort of trauma experiences, sometimes sexual trauma, military sexual trauma, all kinds of different things. So you do have to kind of work within the trauma world. And one of the things that we noticed in working with trauma is that taking an assessment or measuring the level of outcomes at the beginning of every session was very useful and beneficial in doing this process. So if you're doing any sort of evidence-based treatment for PTSD, typically taking that gauge and administering like a PCLR or some kind of trauma symptomology measure early and then often throughout treatment is an excellent way to sort of track the progression or amelioration of symptoms. So I used feedback-informed treatment in both of those capacities and found myself to really fall in love with and appreciate it. Then a couple of years ago, we had a guy by the name of Scott Miller, who's a very famous psychologist out of Chicago, brilliant man, and one of the sort of founding fathers of the notion of feedback-informed treatment. I had the opportunity to see him at a couple of different conferences, and eventually we brought him to PCS to train our staff. And while he is brilliant and his concepts and research has been exceptional, one of the things we kind of discovered over the course of that was that the way in which that it had previously been created didn't necessarily work in our sort of fast-paced clinical outcome setting. So we'll talk a little bit about his measures in a minute, but they do involve like getting out a ruler and measuring where on a line a client draws an X and then entering that in centimeters into the software and using that to kind of track the clinical alliance and the perception of symptoms remission. And many of our outpatient staff kind of had this stronger reaction to it and essentially said, hey, no, thank you. I already don't have enough time. That feels very time intensive to add that additional component to all of my cases. So we kind of went back to the drawing board and redeveloped some things. And that's what we're going to talk about here today. So kind of when we are doing or utilizing feedback informed treatment, we use it to figure out how we can grow as clinicians and then how we can kind of seek out the best version of ourselves. So feedback doesn't always feel good to receive. Sometimes it can leave us feeling kind of about ourselves or feeling kind of stuck within the process. But I also have recognized that the points of my life where I've received some of that harder feedback, if I'm able to kind of be soft to it and let it get in and wrestle around with it versus that immediate, like putting up a wall and trying to ignore the feedback, I have found that in those situations that's where I've had the greatest opportunity for growth. So I'd like to open it up to the group and see if you all or if anybody would be willing to share a time, either personally or professionally, where you received a little bit of feedback and how that seemed to benefit you in the long run. How were you able to soften your heart to that feedback? And then how were you able to take that feedback and integrate it into your clinical practice? So I'm going to open up the floor. Whoever wishes to share can. But I'm just sort of curious about everyone's experiences with implementing feedback. One point of feedback I've received is that I'm exceptionally good at sitting in silence for long, awkward periods of time. So y'all better start preparing to unmute yourself and sharing because this will be uncomfortable.
Talk. I'm generally pretty good with feedback. I mean, it's nothing, in my opinion, it's nothing to take personally. It can only help you, even if you don't particularly like it sometimes. Like that's all it is. It's feedback. It's in its own way, it's its own opinion on your work. So you can kind of take it with a grain of salt. Generally, it's helpful. So, and it's just little things that you can improve, and then you change enough little things, you have a big piece that you want to done. So
very helpful perspective. What about others? What's your own experience with sort of taking and implementing feedback?
I'll talk. I'm an intern at Renaissance, and I never ran a group before starting here, and had very little experience learning about running groups in school. So I have a really good supervisor at Renaissance, and I had a plan for the first group that I was going to run. I had everything written out, my plan for how to run group. And I went to see her for supervision right before I had to implement that. And she said, you know, your ideas are really good, but I think that if you did an activity along this line, it might go over better and you might get more engagement. So I went back and switched things up and incorporated her ideas. And it did. It went much better. It went really good. And I had participation the whole time. So
that's awesome. What about others?
Usually feedback is just people generally trying to help you. So I usually get a lot of it. I usually seek it out. Like I bluntly ask people, how can I fix this? What can I do? I don't have like a specific example because I do it so often, but like just with like little things, I ask them like, how can I do this better?
I feel like the inverse of receiving feedback is having someone just think it and not tell you. And that doesn't feel too great either if somebody's just kind of sitting there holding on to it. And from my perspective, I feel like that's sort of robbing the other person of an opportunity. Now there's helpful and unhelpful ways to provide feedback. Like if I came in and Wendy brought that exercise to me and I said, Wendy, this is terrible. And I threw it in the air and I tore it up. That's going to probably hit home a little bit better than if I maybe said, oh, you know what, I think this is a great exercise, but for our population, you might have some trouble eliciting engagement this way. Have you considered this way? That's going to go a little bit better, but we all, you know, have different strengths and weaknesses in the way that we are able to kind of give and receive and explore those parts of ourselves. So I keep clicking in an effort to get you all a little bit smaller on my screen so I can actually see my slides. There we go. So what we know is that feedback can be personal, it can be specific. It's great when it's unsolicited, when somebody cares enough to come towards us and kind of have that crucial conversation. To give and receive feedback, it takes kind of a small sacrifice for the good of the order. It never feels comfortable. I would say that I've been in my role and in a leadership role now at PCS in different forms and fashions and capacities for about 6 years. And there's never a day that I have to go into a performance evaluation with a staff member and I know it's not going to be positive. There's never a moment where it's like, ooh, that feels good. Like I'm really looking forward to that. Even now, I would say it still is probably my least favorite part of my job. If that's on my agenda for the day, it has a tendency to kind of be the worst part of my day. And just to find space for it and to recognize that it's for the good of the order. So it's important to kind of go in and give that measured and accurate feedback. It's important to give feedback beyond the expectation, like kind of as new things show up and share them. So we might have that initial point of connection, provide some feedback. And as I fall back and watch you take that feedback and implement it into your practice, then it kind of becomes my job to help you continue to hone your skills and look at new things and try different things. And it's not a one-time moment of like, and it's not that unidirectional process, right? It's not like I come in and I say, thou shalt not do this. And then you take that and just run with it, right? But it's a conversation, it's ongoing. That's why we don't just have single supervisions. That's why therapy sessions aren't just one-time stop at therapy and then you go on forever and it's effective. Like you kind of have to have those little points of connection throughout your time. And it's always helpful if you have a relationship in which you give and receive feedback. So it's more beneficial, or it's usually more effective if I am giving feedback to somebody I know personally versus me coming in and giving feedback to somebody I've never met before. So let's say I get feedback from Sarah's direct supervisor, and that comes to me, and then I meet with Sarah and provide it to her. That's probably not all that helpful because Sarah's sitting there thinking like, well, I don't even know you. Like I've been in a couple of your trainings, but what the heck? So I think it's important to also kind of be mindful and aware of that process, and that it does take a certain amount of emotional connection in order to ensure that individuals' hearts are going to be kind of soft to receive that feedback. I think when we're giving feedback to clients or to individuals that we work with, it sort of shows this level of grit and tenacity, a willingness to have uncomfortable conversations, a willingness to say, like, I care about you enough to sort of sit with you and tell you things from my perspective, and recognize that my perspective is just that. It's my perspective. It's not an absolute truth. It's not perfect. It's not one size fits all. Not only when we offer specific feedback or problem feedback, but it's also kind of helpful to give feedback on potential solutions. It's important and helpful to give feedback on different ideas, while also recognizing that maybe my idea on how to solve something isn't going to be congruent for you. I know many of you are not yet operating in the role of an outpatient therapist, though I know many of you kind of aspire to land there at some point in time. The best outpatient therapists is still themselves within the therapy room. So that doesn't mean that you're disclosing large quantities of information or giving exceptional and significant self-disclosures, but you're still you. You show up as you within the therapeutic context. And And so it's important to recognize that even though I might have some ideas about how you can solve something therapeutically or clinically, it's only going to be as effective as it is internally consistent to the person kind of passing that along. I had an experience in my graduate program. I have never identified as a cognitive behavioral therapist. It's just never quite fit for me. Over the course of my own therapeutic journey, I have been a client of cognitive behavioral therapy, and it still didn't quite fit for me. And then I had a supervisor when I was at the training clinic come in and say, like, you will be a cognitive behavioral therapist. Here are your worksheets. Here are your exercises. Go forth and do it. And it just hit me in such a yucky way, because it wasn't conducive for me. It wasn't internally congruent. And therefore it wasn't effective, because I wasn't buying what I was selling, and my clients weren't buying what I was selling because they could feel my own discomfort with the process. Now, since that time, I have supervised some amazing cognitive behavioral therapists, and they've done really great work, and they've helped all of these clients with this model. And I think it's because it was congruent for them. It worked for them. When they brought it into the room, they brought a piece of themselves into the room. And I think that authenticity within the therapeutic relationship is really kind of essential, really essential when it comes to kind of looking at those long-term components or those long-term bonds. It's really important for us when we are doing those pieces that we are being aware of who we are in the therapeutic room. It's important to take ownership for your work culture and sort of attend to some of that. So sometimes you're giving feedback to clients, or clients are giving feedback to you, but also sometimes you're giving feedback to the people who supervise you, and how freaking terrifying is that? But to take a little bit of ownership for your own workplace culture. I always use the example, or an excellent example of one of our clinics. I remember once sitting in a staff meeting with a group of clinicians, and they were all kind of asking me, what point will headquarters kind of get on board and require us all to use the buddy system, so that if anybody's working late into the night, that we make sure that we have overlapping people on those 8 p.m. nights, so that nobody's leaving the clinic completely alone or kind of here alone at work. And when people are leaving or walking out, they can walk out together. And I remember sitting there, and one of our psychologists kind of raised her hand and said, well, why does headquarters have to make this a rule? Why can't we make it a rule? Like, we as clinicians decide that we're going to implement the buddy system at this clinic. And I like jumped out of my seat and was thrilled with that, because I don't know if as an agency that's going to work for every single clinic. But that worked for this clinic. Like, that felt like a good fit. Everybody was on board. Everybody was in agreement that the totality of the staff that worked out of this particular clinic would feel more comfortable if they used that system. And so they've implemented it, and it's been quite effective, and it's been quite beneficial for them. And so I really just want to challenge all of you to feel that level of empowerment. I know that I've worked primarily in outpatient, but in the coming weeks and months that follow, one of my primary goals for 2020 was to get to know the children's services side of PCS a little bit better, get to know the family-based teams a little bit better, get to know our IBHS, BHRS teams a little bit better. And then COVID-19 happened and kind of derailed every plan I ever had. But that's still one of my personal and professional goals moving forward, is kind of understand the other side. And part of that will be my going to TSSs and saying, tell me how I can make your lives easier. Help me understand. I know that it's a hard job. I've done it. And I didn't last very long. So tell me, help me understand what we can do within our current context to improve the role. And I've had experiences with TSS from both sides. So I grew up in a family with a brother with autism. So I grew up with TSSs in my home a lot. And so I've seen the benefit and the value of having TSSs, and I've done the job, and I know that it can be difficult and exhausting and hard. And so sort of how do we synthesize these two truths, recognizing it's such an exceptionally valuable service, And it's an entry-level position for a lot of people that enter in as sort of their first job out of school. And it's hard work. You work a lot with sort of high-risk, high-needs populations. And so how can we support you better in that work? Feedback is often best when it can be short and concise and not muddled by noise, while also being kind. So you're always kind of having that balance. You're trying to synthesize this perception of efficacy, like being effective, like effective communication. So I want to be direct, I want to get my point across, but I don't want to be too harsh, because then even if I get my point across, maybe it won't be heard or received. So I don't want to add so many qualifiers and so many pieces that I compromise the message, but I do want to be aware of my modality to ensure that it's coming across in a way that feels comfortable. And there are times where it's not going to be your problem, it's not your role, but to take responsibility for it anyway can be really beneficial. So maybe it's not your job. So I'm going to pick on Crystal and Rachel. I know that you both work in the same clinic. And so maybe Rachel is watching Crystal interact with a client, and Rachel's noticing some things that from her perspective, Crystal might do a little bit differently to be more effective. It's not necessarily Rachel's job. It's not her responsibility. They're coworkers, they're peers. Rachel is not necessarily responsible for Crystal's work, but sometimes getting that feedback from a peer is so much more important and so much more valuable than getting it from a supervisor, because you're getting it from somebody that kind of gets it, that sees where you are, knows your position perhaps a little bit better. And sometimes that can be really, really beneficial. So any thoughts, questions, reactions about effective communication or effective feedback styles before we kind of move on?
It just, it kind of reminded me of when you were talking about being kind, but not being like too far one way or the other. One of my professors in school would talk about, like, there's a difference between being nice and being kind. And like being nice is kind of like, you know, very surface level, like, oh, that was really good, but it's like not ultimately as helpful.
And I would argue not kind.
Right, yeah. But being kind is like, kind of like you said, you don't want to like throw too much at people so they don't get it. And I've heard, you know, it's good to like offset more constructive feedback with something else that you're doing good. But yeah, that just kind of stuck. I was like, yeah, that makes sense. You don't have to be like nice all the time.
Brene Brown wrote a really good book. It's called Dare to Lead. And it talks a lot about those two, we have it in the PCS library for anybody who's interested. We actually have a bunch of copies because several of our leadership team read that in the last year. But it's called Dare to Lead. And it's kind of all about that notion of like, sometimes you are being nice, but you are not being kind. Like, it is not kind to let somebody kind of walk around the emperor with no clothes, like that everyone kind of sees this except them. Like, that's embarrassing. That's not kind. But you're being nice, just not being kind. So, and kind of balancing that notion that sometimes the kindest thing to do is to lean in and say, like, you are missing the mark, or to lean up. I mean, sometimes the kindest thing I've done is to go to a therapist and say, like, you're not ready for this. And you can get there, but you need to fall back. You need some remediation. There are some pieces. And that's tough. It's a tough, those have been my worst. Some of my worst days have been when I am meeting with somebody that I know is just a wonderful human, a decent person, has a good heart, but isn't there yet. And to allow them to continue to operate within the capacity they're in is harmful to them and harmful to the people that they seek to serve. And knowing them, like knowing that they're good people, knowing that they have a good heart, and knowing that they would never want to harm somebody, the kindest thing is to go in and say, hey, you're not a good fit for outpatient. Would you be interested in this case management role? We'll give you extra training. We can kind of look at how to support you through this so that you can build those skills. Maybe a year from now, 2 years from now, you can look at returning to that role, but right now you're not there yet. And we really, really need to get you there. Also, here's a time for me to kind of plug family-based for anybody that's interested. I would say that those of you that are really interested in moving towards one of those outpatient roles, you will not get better training than you will in family-based. There is no other position that so heavily integrates a training component, other than maybe some of the grant positions. I think from a grant perspective, we're able to offer a heavier amount of training. But still nothing meets sort of the quality of training that individuals will receive as a family-based clinician. And so that if you are a bachelor's level clinician seeking to someday be in an outpatient setting, or a more therapeutic role, I would say family-based is an excellent way to get you there. So let me make y'all a little smaller again so I can see my stuff. So what we know is that average clinical attrition rates hover somewhere around 47%. So that means 47% of clients have a tendency to leave therapy before their time is done. And that they leave for a variety of different reasons. But one of the most heavily cited is a lack of therapist-client fit, just not feeling that connection to their clinician interpersonally or therapeutically. Clinicians don't always see it coming, and oftentimes clinicians fail to identify those clients' highest risk for attrition when discussing their caseload in a supervision or consultation capacity. So we have a tendency to use our supervision and consultation to discuss our clients that might have like the highest level of like interpersonal difficulties, like the clients that are maybe hardest on us. Or we have a tendency to discuss the clients that make us nervous or scared for some reason or another, those that tend to elicit countertransference for us. And probably those have a tendency to be those that are at the highest risk. So either from an SMI perspective, from a suicidality perspective, from a relapse perspective, we have a tendency to discuss those clients. But the clients that are at the highest risk of attrition, we often struggle at really predicting that. And clinicians under supervision have a tendency, at least in my experience, to struggle with those clients that just drop out and you never see them again, but really have no idea why. So that you, hey, sorry, my rabbit is being very noisy today. So we often struggle to really identify those, and then it doesn't feel good. So we know that client attrition is at the highest likelihood after the very first session. That is when individuals are the most likely to leave therapy, never to be seen again. And usually if you can get them to session 3, you're much more likely to be able to complete your treatment dose with them. However, we also have found that feedback-informed treatment can really help us with that. So feedback-informed treatment isn't linked to any type of specific treatment modality or therapeutic orientation. It is an evidence-based program that can be, it's trans-theoretical in nature. So it can be applied if you're a cognitive behavioral therapist, a psychodynamic therapist, an acceptance and commitment therapy therapist, DBT, EMDR, it doesn't matter. Whatever type of therapeutic modality you are most comfortable utilizing, you can use feedback-informed treatment. FIT involves just routinely taking the pulse of the relationship and systematically checking in with the individual to look at both clinical outcomes to determine the direction of treatment and the client's perception of the therapeutic alliance and treatment outcomes. So basically, how does the client feel about you as a clinician and your relationship, and how does the client feel about their own progress within therapy? Do they feel like they're making strides? Is therapy living up to their expectations? And sometimes this can be useful in sort of addressing concerns. So sometimes clients feel guilty because they're not getting better fast enough. Or sometimes clients are really struggling because they're feeling like you're not hearing them, but they're not comfortable. They don't feel comfortable or empowered enough to connect with you and say, hey, I don't feel like you're hearing me, or I feel like you're missing something from me. That has a tendency to really get in the way of therapeutic progress. So feedback-informed treatment can be done in a variety of different ways. It doesn't have to be uniform. We've created some tools for our outpatient staff to utilize in feedback-informed treatment, but frankly, the emergence of COVID has kind of gotten in the way of some of our progress in that area. One of our hopes was also to implement feedback-informed treatment in a group context. And we still have yet to do that successfully, mostly because we could not figure out how to operationalize it. And so that's something we're still working on and trying to figure out. But FIT involves routinely taking the pulse of the relationship and kind of reaching out. And so that can be done through a tool. The tool we utilize here at PCS is called the iCare, and we'll talk about that later. But it also can be just a verbal checking in. So like, hey, any feedback for me about our session today? Is there anything from your perspective that maybe I didn't hear quite clearly or could have heard better? Is there anything from your perspective that I'm missing or is important for me to know before we wrap up today? Or I like to use it at the beginning of the next session as well, and just kind of, hey, so checking in, how do you feel like over the course of the last week? How do you feel like our work last week? Did you have any reflections on that, or did you happen to notice anything? And if you do therapy for any period of time, you realize that therapy is effective, not because of what happens in that 45 minutes within the therapy room, but because of the unfinished nature of the therapeutic work, and that the client leaves the therapy session and kind of goes out into their world and practices the skills that you've taught them, or continues to wrestle with some concepts that you've introduced, or their psychological immune system kicks in and kind of helps them find a place to settle within a place that's felt really unsettled. And I would say all of those different pieces and components can be really, really exceptionally beneficial to the client. But it's only beneficial in as far as you're checking in and utilizing it. So it can be a super beneficial bridge. Additionally, if you've done therapy for any period of time, you've had clients where you've left the therapy session and you thought that therapy session went really, really well, and you never see that client again. And you send letters and you call, and they never follow back up again. Or you've had that client that you've left the therapy room and you feel like it went really, really well, and they come back into the next session and they are furious with you. Or maybe they call between the last session and the next appointment and they won't talk to you. They speak to a supervisor and they want to be transferred to a new clinician. And you're kind of sitting there like, what the heck? I thought things went really, really well. Feedback-informed treatment is a great way to kind of get a gauge of that, get an understanding of that. It's a way to kind of lean in and discuss with your clients if you're not a good fit for them, because you're not a good fit for everyone. It just is what it is. Good therapists, the best therapists, can't be everything to everybody. The therapeutic relationship is really essential. It's really important when it comes to therapeutic progress. And it's ridiculous to assume that you're capable of developing close and meaningful relationships with literally every single human on the face of this planet. So there's nothing wrong with you if you're not connected to a client. There's nothing wrong with the client if they're not connected to you. It's just not a good fit, and that's okay. There's certain people I'm not a good fit for. I talk like a pirate. I'm working really hard on my trainings, realizing a lot of people are at home with children in the room, to not use the F word, but it's a pretty big part of my vocabulary. If I work with a client that's really uncomfortable with that, I try to rein that back, but I work primarily in a forensic setting where actually my foul use of language is beneficial to me. It aids and fosters a connection. It takes the doctor away in front of my name and allows them to sort of connect to me on a human level, recognizing that many incarcerated populations came from a very different background from myself. But it's a way to sort of connect and join and foster a sense of trust. And engaging in some of that mirroring that we talk about in different things, while also giving them permission to use whatever language allows them to feel most effective in their communication. However, it's not always beneficial, it's not always useful, and it's not a good fit for everyone. And that's okay. It's okay. I once worked with a client that I really, really cared about. I worked with him for a very long time. He was in his mid to late 50s, and was probably one of the most chronically depressed humans I've ever met personally. He was just kind of a lump of a man by the time he ended up in my office. And he was chronically suicidal. Every time he left, I always worried and wondered, like, would I see him again? We worked really hard together. We did a lot of different therapeutic exercises. And over the course of about a year and a half of our treatment, I remember early on, the only reason he wasn't killing himself is because he had this cat that he knew no one would take if he were to be dead. And every day he would leave my office, I would just pray for the safety of that cat, recognizing that was the one thing kind of standing between him and suicidal behavior. And it was an indoor-outdoor cat, and I wished he would bring the cat inside. But over the course of our work together, he grew his world to be so much bigger. He got connected to a church program where it really fostered and elicited social relationships. He started his own small business, and it was quite successful. He navigated some health challenges. And so after the end of all of that, through all of our work, one day he came in and said, "Hey, I'd like a new therapist." And I was like, "What? Like, we've done all this work. You're no longer chronically suicidal. You've made all of these changes. Our work together has been really effective. Like, what's going on?" And in that moment, I kind of took it personally because I cared about the guy and I felt connected to him. And so it was hard for me. But I put that on a shelf, thank goodness. And I was able to kind of connect to him and have the conversation. Well, walk me through what's the rationale behind looking for a new therapist, or what's kind of eliciting this desire to change. And as we got into it and as we started to kind of unpack his perceptions and his experiences, something came to the surface that I knew but had forgotten. And that was that he had a pretty significant childhood history of childhood sexual trauma. And that's something he wanted to work on. And he said, at the end of the day, you remind me a lot of my daughter, and it would be weird to talk to my daughter about this. And I would like to speak with somebody, maybe a little bit older, maybe somebody male. I'd like to explore this with someone else. And so in that, I was a great fit for the first part of his journey. I was a good fit for his stabilization. But he was never quite stable enough to work on that sexual trauma. And he was, by the time we ended our work together, he had landed at a place where he could safely encounter that and move forward effectively, but I wasn't the right fit for the next phase. And so kind of had to take my own feelings, put it on the shelf, and transfer him to a clinician that was ready to walk the next step of his journey. And it's okay. You can't be everything to everyone. So once you get the data from the client, what do you do? Well, I think it's really important to integrate that feedback into improving your care and service delivery, and recognizing that not all feedback is something you can do. So I've gotten feedback from clients that have said, I like our work together, but I'd like you to be more proactive in your advice giving. And I don't necessarily believe that giving advice is a heavy part of the therapeutic process from my perspective. I don't think that the role of the clinician is to give advice. And so in hearing that, I would often kind of explore that with the client, but then ultimately say, well, I think your feedback is valuable, and let's look at another way to meet that need. I'm not comfortable transitioning from my role of therapist into maybe a life coach or something like that. I think that position is much more likely to give advice, whereas I'm much less comfortable with that therapeutically. Continue to have those critical conversations with the client so that you can figure out how to better meet the clinical need. Modify the treatment plan. I work with so many clinicians that are like, oh, the treatment plan, it's just one more piece of paper, one more clinical document to update. No, it's actually a plan for your treatment. It's a useful clinical tool. Don't put it in that category of like meaningless and senseless documentation. There's certainly things that fall in that category. Absolutely, I will grant you that. There are questions on our intake that are only there because auditors will give us citations if they're not, and those are senseless, arbitrary things, and you're allowed to categorize them as such. But the treatment plan is supposed to be a collaborative document between client and clinician to explore goals and elicit feedback and check in on progress towards those goals. And if you put it into that category of arbitrary, useless, senseless clinical documentation, you are robbing yourself of such an essential clinical tool. So be mindful and aware of your work in treatment planning, and update that. So we do have requirements about how often they need to be updated, but as important and valuable information comes out, update the treatment plan, change it, alter it, make it fit the therapeutic work that you're doing. So I've worked with clients that maybe in the first session we develop a treatment plan, and then you realize, as many of us do, that clients usually aren't totally authentic and forthcoming about why they're really in therapy until that third or fourth session. They need to get to know you. They need to trust you. They're not just going to come in and lead with everything. They've got to know you first. So maybe the treatment plan isn't due to be updated for 3 or 4 more weeks. But if you're making a massive clinical shift, update the treatment plan to reflect that clinical shift. And then use some evidence-based stuff. Pull it in. If you're doing trauma work, use an evidence-based trauma protocol. If you're working with somebody on interpersonal effectiveness, pull some stuff out of the DBT literature. If somebody is struggling with significant anxiety or major depressive disorder, adopt an ACT protocol. And you don't need to be a therapy robot and stringently stick to step 1 or step 2 or step 3, but use it to inform your practice. Because there are people that are smarter than all of us that developed this and studied it for years and years and years. Don't reinvent the wheel. There are super effective tools out there that you can call upon and implement into your practice that's going to cause you to be more effective, and really prevent. So a drum that, if you're in any trainings with me, a drum that I bang often is self-care and preventing your own stress and burnout. And sometimes a little bit of planning can go a really long way in that regard. So I found that one of my most effective tools for self-care is engaging in engaging in trainings and kind of developing my skill set in that area and growing my clinical tools, because nothing burns me out more than really feeling stuck within a therapeutic relationship. So to sort of build upon that. So some of the questions that often remain is fit effective? Does fit work? What we have found is that routine outcomes monitoring and feedback increases client retention rates at over 50%. So yes, it's effective. And we can only be as effective as our clients are actually in the room with us. So it increases those client retention rates over 50%. It decreases deterioration of clients. So clients that remain in treatment but slowly and slowly and slowly get worse, as much as 33%. And it reduces hospitalizations and lengths of stay as much as 66%. So feedback-informed treatment works. It's effective. It decreases that demoralization within clinicians. It increases positive outcomes for our clients. Really, it can't be beat. So I am going to push everybody into some small breakout rooms. And because we have a pretty small team here today, you'll only be in 2 different rooms. But I would like you to spend some time discussing in your small groups, how do you elicit feedback about the relationship or efficacy? How do you feel when you're asked for your opinion about something? And then what do you see as barriers to feedback? So what kind of gets in the way of you having positive feedback, either obtaining feedback, or what are your barriers at integrating your feedback? So I'm going to, I'm watching everyone trickle back in. So everyone's coming back. So what do people notice? What are some of the themes associated with feedback? What gets in the way? How do you overcome it?
I know for our group, we talked about not taking feedback too personally, feeling the need to defend the feedback that we're hearing, to just kind of listen and absorb it. I mentioned for myself, especially when I first started as a TSS, I tended to take feedback very personally. And my BSc is like, you don't need to explain or defend, just, listen and absorb it. So we made that one of my goals, is to get better at just accepting the feedback and not trying to explain away, like, why I did this, or, she's like, I'm trying to tell you, this is what a parent or teacher saw, and this is, might not be how you meant something, but this is how they're perceiving it. So keeping in mind other people's perspectives and things like that, and just not being so defensive. I think it's just a natural reaction to feedback, especially when it's constructive criticism. You want to defend yourself.
What about others? What kind of stands in the way of that growth opportunity for us?
We talked like a really small piece about, just for like the last few seconds that we have, but about like delayed feedback, or feedback that's not necessarily on about your work, but about you. Like when I did my 6-month review, they kind of told me like, you didn't really seem into it at first, but that's fine because like you're better now. And I was like, but I was into it. It was just like a lot to learn, a lot to take in. I was just trying to like do my best at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Or I don't know if you've ever had anybody come to you be like, oh, I've been fixing this for you for, I don't know, the last, a week or two, but this is how you do it so that you can do it. It's like, oh, you should have told me a long time ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's tough. I think it's funny, the feedback that when I was traveling around and talking to all of our outpatient therapists, like there was feedback about like sometimes in outpatient, when you make a mistake on clinical documentation, you get what's called an AFR assigned to your clinical documentation to correct. And the feedback was so bimodal, like I got so much of both. So one side of the line is like, when I make a mistake, like forget to put a client ID or forget to do this or that. Why can't you just fill it in? Like, you know what it is. Why does it have to get assigned to me and then kicked back and then come back? Like, just fill it in. And then the other side of that is, when I make this mistake or forget this, why don't you just tell me right away and like assign the AFR? And so it's also funny, or one of the things that struck me the most, or I thought was the funniest about feedback, is sometimes we get exact opposite feedback, either like how to lead, or even I know I've gotten personal feedback where one of my growth edges is just being less certain. I am a very certain person. I always know best. I'm always ready to shoot off like a rocket towards the objective truth that I clearly see. But then also I've gotten feedback that's like, you need to be a little bit more confident. Sometimes it feels like you hem and haw too much. And so and I've gotten those feedbacks like sometimes within the same week. I was talking to one of our other leaders this week, and she said, yeah, like on one side of the line, I'm told that I'm too soft and I need to be harder. And then on the other side of the line, I'm being told that I'm a bitch and that I have this weird bitch face when I'm talking to people. And she's like, and how do I synthesize these two truths? It's like, man, I don't know. You gotta, I guess, constantly wrestle with it and roll around with it. And it's probably context dependent at some points. Like, I know that in certain contexts, I can be really certain. And then in other areas, I hem and haw and just to get engaged in that analysis paralysis for weeks at times. And it can drive people crazy. So, I mean, sometimes we do. I think that to some degree, our greatest strength can also sometimes be our greatest weakness. And so to just sort of recognize that and know that sometimes people are going to want more of that, and sometimes people are going to want less of that. And usually that all or nothing is never effective anyway. So kind of trying to decide how you can lean lean in, and then realizing that, oh, the pendulum swung too far this direction, and now you got to lean back a little bit and try to find that middle ground. But man, it's a process and it is exhausting. Anything else before we move on regarding feedback and how to be open to it, how to pull it in and look at it from a place that doesn't like annihilate us, but also we're not so defensive that nothing touches home, that it's not like trying to plant flowers in concrete? How do you find that middle ground where your heart is soft enough, but not so soft that it's mushy, but not so hard that nothing can take root? All right, well then we will keep going. Now I keep doing that where I So there's a lot of different kinds of theory of change that kind of explores the mechanism behind effective therapeutic processes. The first is the client's theory of change, which is that like the method of therapeutic intervention. So ACT versus CBT versus motivational interviewing versus cognitive processing, or whatever else, fill in whatever other alphabet soup there that you see fit. The client, so that can be a barrier. The client's perception of the relationship is extremely important. And you'll notice that I say the client's perception of the relationship. I don't say the therapist's perception of the relationship. Truly, it is like what's valuable here is how the client perceives the relationship to be. And then last but not least, like the goals, the meaning, the purpose, what you're working on, what you're driving towards, some of the strategies you're utilizing, like all of that comprises a component of the change process as well. Sort of the inverse of that is other mechanisms of change. So about 45% of client change has been contributed to therapeutic factors or client factors. About 30% can be relationship factors. Models or techniques only take about 15%. So theorists have argued from the times of Freud about what is most effective. And what we know is that that doesn't really matter all that much, but the therapeutic relationship is really important. And last but not least, the notion of placebo or hope. And I lump those into the same category because I feel like that installation of hope and eliciting feelings of hopefulness about a potential outcome really does play a pretty heavy mechanism in the change process when it comes to the clients that we're serving. So overall, we have certain methods or mechanisms of change that are kind of really famous. And this is the one by Scott Miller. Specifically, he uses the ORS and the SRS, where clients are presented with these two measures that you see on paper format. So it's printed kind of uniformly on paper. Then they take a pencil or pen and kind of put an X on the line wherever they feel as though this would land. And then the therapist takes out a ruler and measures it within centimeters and then enters that in to a database, which then will generate a chart or graph that kind of shows you the overall experience within so sort of how they're rating their own outcomes and then how they're rating the session or the therapeutic relationship. And essentially Scott Miller recommends that you do this every session within the last 5 minutes and kind of explore that with the client. And should anything stir up, then it's really important for you to discuss with the client exactly what is stirring up for them. And that would be sort of an important beginning step here. And I've worked with a lot of clinicians that have utilized this particular strategy, and many find them quite effective. But it also is a bit cumbersome. So let's say you're seeing 40 clients in a week. You could see how that could add a little bit extra time to your work week and how that could feel difficult if you're doing that many sessions within a week. So at PCS, we shifted a little bit. Part of what we did in outpatient was to start by creating that culture of feedback. So we started that on a leadership level. So last January, so January 2019, we brought in all of our leadership staff, and I conducted probably was one of my most controversial leaderships ever. It got very mixed reviews, really challenging our staff to go out there and take some risks and be authentic. And sort of drive towards some areas of conflict where essential. Some of the feedback that I had gotten over previous sessions was kind of similar to what Casey had mentioned. This idea of there was this feedback, but you waited 6 months to give it to me, and that's not super helpful for me in the moment. So kind of challenging our leadership staff to take those bigger risks and go out there and meet with our clinicians and our staff and have those more critical conversations. And we used some of the information from Brene Brown in that Dare to Lead book that I mentioned about rumbling, like going in and saying, like, I care about you enough to rumble with you. I mean, we've also had staff over different periods of time where we've gone in and just sort of terminated the employment, saying you're just not a good fit. So that's sort of one side of the line in an area that we sometimes go, but that's only in really egregious situations. Much more importantly is to move in and have that rumbling conversation and saying, I see your strength areas here, 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 and here. And for those reasons, I want you on my team. But these pieces, these areas over here, like A, B, C, and D, that's a little bit problematic. And I would say that we need to address that and kind of work on that. And sit down with the clinician or staff member, and sometimes we develop different sorts of remediation plans. Sometimes we find a system that works a little bit better or a little bit worse, kind of depending upon the client's upon the clinician's own kind of strengths and weaknesses and needs and areas of growth. Sometimes those conversations involved having the right seat on the bus. So saying, right now you're in this role and that doesn't feel like it's a good fit for you for whatever reason. So let's explore this role over here. And I would challenge you as clinicians and staff members to not just sort of sit back and wait for that conversation to come towards you, but to reach out and seek that feedback. Especially if you have different aspirations or goals within the company. I've sat down, especially since COVID-19 and like Zoom and Doxy.me make it a lot easier. I've sat down and scheduled a number of one-to-one appointments with different staff members who have said, listen, I want to stay with PCS. I believe in what we do. I believe in our mission here. And I like my role for now, but ideally I want to be there, or I want to be in leadership, or I want to be more administrative, or I want to work in outpatient, or I want to go to family-based, and kind of sitting down and identifying a path that would make sense for them to get from point A to point B. And maybe I'm not the person to walk that journey with you, but your direct supervisor might be able to help you and give you a little bit more consistent feedback, or reach out to me. I'm happy to schedule something as well. But that's been something that we're really working to create here as a culture. And it's not like after last year we arrived by any stretch of the imagination, but to continue to do that. Then how do you do it next? Well, you've got to integrate outcomes and alliance feedback into the standard practice of clinical care. So we've got to work with our clinicians to help them feel more comfortable to lean into our clients. I operate from the assumption that you can never really have that critical or crucial conversation in a context where people lack resources. So if I don't feel safe, if I don't feel comfortable, if I'm exhausted, if I'm overwhelmed, that's not a great time to have an effective conversation, right? We need to find ways to have clinicians feel safe and comfortable in implementing the work that they do. So we need to create a context in which clinicians are engaging in appropriate self-care, where they are setting healthy and appropriate clinical boundaries for both themselves and their clients. We need to create that context where there's that emotional and psychological space to grow. When you're so busy surviving, you're not going to be able to grow. That's why I find graduate school so weird and paradoxical, because I have never met anybody that has like a healthy work-life balance while in graduate school. And yet it's supposed to be these most formative years of your career. So it's weird and uncomfortable and odd in that way. and yet it kind of is what it is. So how can you find that space to grow both personally and professionally during a time where you feel like you're being waterboarded? And to be honest, I never really figured out the answer, but I did survive my graduate career. So it is possible. And then last but not least, learning to fail successfully and finding a way in which you reframe failure for yourself, that you reframe. I think Edison has a famous quote that said, well, I didn't fail. I just learned 10,000 different methods that didn't work. And I think for a lot of us, sometimes that's what we're doing. We are in the process of ruling out potential options and leaning into strategies that are going to be the most effective. So I want to, I'm going to switch mediums here for a second, and I want to put, no, end show. Thank you. What I am going to do is put up a video for you all to watch, and then when it's done, I'm going to ask you all to take a break for a minute, and then we will regroup when it is all completed. Let me see if I can find the right video, though. I should have had it saved. Sorry about that. I think this is the right one. No thanks. No, I don't want to click on the ad.
It's anything but business as usual. That's why AT&T is committed to keeping you connected so you can keep your customers served and your employees closer than ever. It's what we've always done. It's what we'll always do.
You've got an amazing story. I mean,
can you all see that?
This is something that every woman has.
Yeah.
How did you come up with this idea? Actually, my own butt was the inspiration because as a woman, I couldn't figure out what to wear under my white pants. So I don't know if Warren's had the same problem, but a lot of women do. And I was a frustrated consumer that had no business background and no retail experience, but I knew there was a void between the traditional underwear and the heavy duty girdle. And so that's sort of the moment that happened, was so that I could wear these pants that hung in my closet.
You made your own.
I made my own. I did. How did you do it? I just cut the feet out of control top pantyhose one day and realized that that worked better than anything I could buy on the market as far as smoothing and getting rid of any blemishes or panty lines, but they rolled up my leg all night under my pants. So I went home that night and said, I've got to figure out a way to comfortably keep this just below the knee.
I mean, it sounds so simple. It sounds so obvious.
I know.
It was something that had never been done before.
Yeah.
And for anybody who thinks, oh, you were somebody who was sitting around with a lot of spare time on your hands, or that you were born with a silver spoon in your mouth, tell me a little bit. I mean, I think you are the epitome of the American dream, because you were working at the time. Were you selling fax machines door to door at this point?
Yes.
For how many years were you doing
I
that?
sold fax machines for 7 years. It was basically my only job pretty much out of college, and, was cold calling for a living. I got kicked out of businesses all the time for years, and I, did that until I cut the feet out of pantyhose. So I had $5,000 set aside in my savings, and when I came up with the idea, I just went on the internet and started researching hosiery or shapewear. Where does this stuff get made? How does it get made? And that started my journey of Spanx. I found out that most of it was made in North Carolina. So lucky for me, it was close enough to where I was living. I could drive there on weekends and take vacation days and go during the week. But this wasn't an easy thing. And I think your background as someone selling fax machines door to door really helped. You heard no a lot. I heard no a lot. And someone who grew up wanting to be a lawyer, but basically bombed the LSAT twice and then ended up at Disney World. And I tried out to be goofy, but you have to be 5'8", and I'm only 5'6", so they wanted me to be a chipmunk. I mean, I was not on a very good trajectory. And then, you know, they hired me to sell fax machines because pretty much they would hire anyone that was willing to try that. And you know, I feel very much like I embody the American dream. I feel so lucky to be a woman in this country and to be given this opportunity. And I have all these pinch me moments because not long ago I was selling fax machines, and now I'm sitting here with you and next to Warren Buffett. It's like, how did this happen to me? You know, Warren, you talked about Fred Smith earlier and his creation of FedEx.
She is just like Fred Smith. She's the reason you have to be bullish on America. They both saw a need, and they took kind of common ingredients to solve that need. But they've been sitting in front of everybody else. But she was thinking about what can you do to make in this case, women's lives better. Now she's got them for men.
Well,
what's going to happen now.
What are you holding in your hand?
I'm holding a gift which promises to transform my whole public persona. I may go change while we're doing this, and you'll see a new Warren.
Andrew, this is your obsession. This is what we are holding. He's holding right now one of those undershirts that you were talking about.
So I'm wearing one of yours, Sarah. I shouldn't take my shirt off, but I'm wearing one of her. I'm wearing one of her undershirts.
But you had Spanx on. Oh, so it's not a.
No, she makes.
You don't have the pants.
I don't have the pants.
This isn't the one that I want. Sorry. I should have saved it better. Let's see. That is not the correct one, though. It is all about her failure. And she goes through like all of her different, I mean, obviously she didn't get selected to be goofy, so that stinks, but that doesn't really feel like the end of the world. But it was let's try this one.
New Microban 24 watches both brands kill 99.9% of bacteria and viruses. The difference, even after multiple touches, Microban 24 keeps killing bacteria for 24 hours. New Microban 24.
My dad used to actually encourage my brother and me to fail growing up. Would ask us at the dinner table, what did you fail at this week? And if I didn't have something to tell him, he'd actually be disappointed. And I can vividly remember saying, Dad, I tried out for this and I was horrible. And he would give me a high five. And what he was doing was basically reframing failure for me. And failure ultimately became about not trying versus the outcome. Well, the mindset of not being afraid to fail was a huge defining part of creating Spanx, because I heard the word no for 2 straight years when I first was trying to get it made. It made me a lot braver and made me want to take more risks. If more parents are open to asking their children what they failed at and celebrating it, then children will start to be braver and take more risks and less fearful. So I say go for it.
All right, there we are.
Hello, Today fans. Thanks
So
for
this
checking out
idea
my
of kind of
YouTube channel.
reframing failure, looking at your failure from a different perspective and finding comfort into, or sort of making meaning out of negative feedback that we receive from our clients or even from coworkers or staff as we sort of hone our clinical skills and improve our therapeutic outcomes. So any thoughts or reactions to this idea that failure is actually something worthy of a high five?
I love that idea, honestly, because it's like, I like how she said it's not about the outcome, it's more about trying or not trying something. Failure by her and her family's definitions, a success is something to be celebratory of. And I love that. I think that's definitely a hindrance to our society's growth, like as a whole. Like, yeah, because we strive for perfection. we strive for success, but it's like, if you don't try something, then you don't know if you're good at it, or you won't know that you'll be successful in, you know? So I love it. I really love it. And especially coming from like my family, like my own family background too. It's like, yeah, I think it's like my own family outcome is, we're all about like the outcome, like what we can accomplish, you know? And so I really, yeah, I just love that a lot. Yeah.
Other thoughts or reactions to this particular style of relating?
Yeah,
It reminds me.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to say it reminds me of this book that I was reading. It's called Rejection Proof, where it's this man, he's going out and doing things to seek rejection and
he's so fun.
Kind of overcome that fear. Yeah, so it's been an interesting read, and it kind of allowed me to see it in this light too. To when you show that video of just overcoming that fear of failure as well, because that's definitely something that is instilled at a very young age, and we're not taught to say it's okay to fail at certain things, and learn how to deal with that as well. So,
yeah, the rejection proof, if you ever have a chance, watch some of his YouTube videos, because it's hilarious. This guy, in an effort to start his own entrepreneurial business, just went out and started doing whatever he could to get people to say no to him. And he got a lot of no's. So he wanted to get immune to the feeling of being told no. But along the way, it's also pretty funny what people said yes to. And like one of them was, he showed up at some random guy's house and rung the doorbell and asked if he could play soccer in his backyard. And the guy was like, yeah, sure, why not? And he's like, so now I'm in this guy's backyard and I have to pretend I wanted to be here, and like, what happens next? So he's a funny guy if you ever have an opportunity to see him speak. I think we also have his video in the PCS library, because he was at the Global Leadership Summit last year, and so we always buy the DVDs from that and put it in the library so you can watch his lecture. It was pretty funny.
I'm sorry, what was his name?
Oh gosh, what was his name?
It's Jiang. I'll write it in the chat section.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I can't. Sorry, I can't remember his name either, but he was funny. And he went to Krispy Kreme and asked her to make the donuts into the rings of the Olympics.
The Olympic shape, yeah.
And she did it. She did a pretty good job too. It was cute. All right then. Well, we are going to take 15 and then I'll meet back here. So I will connect with you all when we get back. We will get started here again. So any questions, any reflections before we keep moving? Okay. Let me. So feedback-informed treatment. Involves the utilization of a clinical tool and a mindset. There has to be a mindset, or else it's really not going to land. You're going to miss something. It's not going to be as effective. I think one of the areas that I've kind of seen our clinicians fall into since we've implemented feedback-informed treatment here at PCS is that there's sometimes this perception of, it's just one more thing, can't we have the support staff do it? Or it's just one more thing, can't we have them do it online prior to the session? And really that lacks the clinical utility. So the value behind feedback-informed treatment isn't the data, it's not the numbers, it's the process. And I think that's where people find themselves getting really stuck. They find themselves thinking like, well, if we just gave them this piece of paper, they filled it out, and then we dealt with it later, yeah, I mean, that could work, that could be effective, but that's not really where the secret sauce is when it comes to feedback-informed treatment. Sorry, someone is calling me and I need to decline it. And it's not really where the secret sauce lands. So we find ourselves kind of stuck in this limbo zone where some clinicians really kind of struggle with having that level of vulnerability within the therapeutic relationship in leaning into having those critical conversations with our clients. It deserves a discussion, and not just a discussion, but an exploration. So can you imagine a time in your life where you were asked for feedback, maybe in terms of filling out a form or kind of maybe doing a survey after the fact, filling it out, sending it in, and you never really hear anything ever again? Did you feel positively towards that method of feedback, or did it kind of get lost in the shuffle? Did you ever really think about it again? And so the idea of having maybe support staff complete fit questionnaires in lieu of therapists, or having clinicians or clients being sent to a website to do it in the absence of their clinician, wow, you might get more accurate data in terms of the client being willing to say, like, yeah, I can't stand this person, or something along those lines. Maybe they feel uncomfortable giving that feedback with the clinician in the room. I would also argue then that in and of itself is a problem within the therapeutic context, because the client doesn't feel safe enough or comfortable enough to kind of lean in and say, listen, you're not meeting my need, and you're not meeting my need in this specific way. And maybe if this happened, it would feel more helpful. It's important that when you are trying to engage in feedback-informed treatment with a client, that you take the time to introduce it well and help them understand that you are a human being with your own biases and flaws and beliefs and story and all of this nonsense and shenanigans that bumps around within your corporal form that will get in the way of your ability to do great therapy. Now, we know that you use your supervision and you use your training and you rely on some of these external tools to try to keep your own countertransference under control, to try to be aware of your own cognitive or behavioral limitations. But it's only effective in as far as you're utilizing it. So spend some time to introduce it to the client. Let them understand that you're not going to take that negative feedback super personally, that you're really seeking to serve them the best. Maybe be mindful to introduce the fact that you've used this feedback historically to improve your provision of service and assist clients in a way that is more helpful or beneficial. Really encourage that honesty with the clients, and that it's not about hurting your feelings, but it's truly about helping you help them. And that emphasize that getting that clearer picture of the client's viewpoint is really essential to effective treatment. You can't do it without it. And then last but not least, clarify that this is diagnostic, not bureaucratic. I would never want a clinician to utilize feedback-informed treatment just to check a box, just to have that data in the chart so that when they're audited, they don't have to explain why they don't use feedback-informed treatment. That is a barrier. You really, it's not about that. And if that's the only reason why you're doing it, then don't do it. It's not going to be effective. If you're not buying into the notion or the concept of routinely eliciting feedback from the client, you're losing sight of what the tool is really about. And if it's just one more thing to do, one more box to check, one more thing getting in the way of you providing quality service versus a tool or an avenue to the provision of that quality service, then you're missing something. And it's not going to be effective long term. Questions about any of that? So some potential feedback or information that you might want to discuss with your clients. So the notion of here at PCS, we're attempting to work things a little bit differently, and I'm very interested in your feedback. If I'm going to be helpful, if our work together is going to be helpful, we should see signs of that maybe sooner rather than later. If our work helps, we're going to continue as long as you like. But if our work doesn't feel helpful, then I need to seek some consultation around that week 3 or week 4, and maybe even explore a potential referral to somebody else. I value your opinion about the work that we do. And I hope that I hope to use your feedback to tailor your treatment to your individual needs. The purpose of feedback-informed care isn't about changing who you are clinically. It isn't about changing who you are as a human being. but it's about shifting the tools that you use in service of most effective best practices. And I would imagine that any of us have probably been in a relationship where somebody seeking feedback and providing accurate feedback and then having that feedback implemented would have been abundantly helpful to us. You can probably imagine relationships throughout your life that if they came to you and said, hey, how can I relate to you better? And you told them, and then they took that and they made changes, how different would the outcome of that relationship have been? So the therapeutic relationship is just that. It's just another relationship. It's different than a lot of other relationships for a whole host of other reasons, all of which are discussed very nicely in the Boundaries training by Crystal Porter. So I recommend, if you haven't taken that, pop on over there at some point in time. But we still are a type of relationship. And so it's really important that we're leaning in and kind of exploring the ways in which our relationships really hit the bullseye, and then maybe the times where we've missed the mark. And taking that and using that to be better therapists overall, and then better therapists to this individual person. So here's one way to sort of describe or emphasize the language. So I want to start out by saying that I'm not aiming for a perfect score or a 10 out of 10. Life isn't perfect, neither am I. What I am aiming for is your feedback about even the smallest things, even if to you it doesn't feel totally important, so that we can adjust our work together and make sure we don't steer off course. Whatever it might be, I promise I'm not going to take it personally. I'm always learning, and I'm curious about what I can learn from getting feedback from you that will in time help me improve my skills in working with you. Does that make sense? That's one way to introduce. I realize that my paragraph or my introduction might not be conducive to you, but I always like to give examples and give some information about what might be effective or what that might look like. Because in talking to different clinicians, sometimes they struggle with this idea of actually truly giving that feedback in a way that feels conducive. So what do you do when you get negative feedback? Holy smokes, man. My client just told me they don't like me. My client just told me that I'm not a good fit for them. My client just told me that it doesn't feel like I'm listening to them. What do I do? So when you're getting that feedback, maybe start out by exploring something pretty concrete. Like, did it feel like we talked about the right topics today? And maybe they say, well, yeah, I wanted to talk about my marriage. And I feel like from the moment I walked in here, all you wanted to talk about was my recent relapse. And as a good drug and alcohol therapist, it's important to explore relapse and what's kind of getting in the way of that. The way of sustained recovery, but it's also important to be consistent with the client's values. And so if they're coming to you and they're saying, this is important to me, this is what I want to talk about, imagine how invalidating it would be if you're constantly veering off course and trying to take it back to your own agenda. That doesn't mean that you never arrive at your own agenda. It doesn't mean that you never discuss it, but it's really important to be mindful and aware of what the client is bringing to you and saying, this is important to me. Maybe ask them, what was the least helpful thing that happened in our last session? Check in about your language and your content. I know that sometimes we can be too heady, or I've worked with clinicians, especially in those like early entry level stages of clinical practice, that you struggle to take the language that you learned from your textbooks and your classes and kind of translate it to client care. And so sometimes you're using like therapy vernacular that just they don't know what you're talking about. Maybe this individual has a second grade reading level. You're not on the same page. So sometimes zooming in and making sure that there's something about maybe the language that you're utilizing that's either effective or ineffective. Did I fail to ask you about something that you considered important or wanted to talk about, but didn't? And I usually, with any client, regardless of whatever the fit question is, will lean in and kind of say, well, was there something left unsaid from our session today? Or was there any point in time during our session today that you felt like I didn't hear you? Because we're human beings. We're people. We're not therapy robots. We all have our own stories, our own biases, our own lenses with which we look at something. And our own beliefs can negatively impact our ability to see what our clients are trying to tell us. So even though we think we heard them correctly, it still had to filter through that brain of ours that isn't always helpful and has a tendency to kind of throw up our own stuff. And so as it travels through that bizarre game of telephone in our minds, it might come out of our mouths in a way that the client didn't intend it. We misheard what they had intended to say. And so that's a really effective part of interpersonal communication, is stopping and saying, am I hearing you correctly? So this is what I'm hearing. Is that consistent with your experience? Help me understand a little bit more. I'm not quite sure I'm getting it, or I'm not quite sure I'm understanding it. Checking in with clients about, was the session too short, too long? And it's always important. It's not just important, it's essential to prevent fraud, that if you're shifting a session time, that you're documenting that accordingly. But we have some clients that they'll come in and they'll be with you for 30 minutes and they're like, yep, all right, peace out, doc, I'm done. That's it. I don't have anything else today. And instead of trying to drag the session on for another 9 minutes to get that higher billable code, maybe it's important to just change your documentation and document that within the body of the note, and ensure you change your CPT code so you're not committing fraud and billing for the wrong session length. But it's important to listen to the client's feedback on that. The inverse of that is sometimes we have clients that say they want that longer session. They want those 53 minutes, that 53 to 60-minute session. And then maybe check your own schedule, autopsy your own heart, and make sure that that's a good fit for you clinically and for lifestyle and self-care and all that kind of stuff. But if you can do it, do it. And then make sure you're changing the CPT codes and the billables and the time in and time out so that it accurately reflects the provision of service. Checking in on understanding, and even if you think you're understanding, making sure you're understanding, or making sure that they're understanding that you're understanding. I once had a client that said, you know what, you say too much. And I've always been like a very active listener, so I was like, and they said, I don't like that. I like to just talk, and I want you to be quiet for a minute and listen. You don't need to constantly reflect to me that you're listening. And so I had to untrain myself a little bit. They're like, you're breaking my train of thought. I can't think about it. So whereas other clients might not respond positively to like long stretches of silence, some just kind of want you to be there and be that vessel and kind of that holding place as they kind of get it all out. And then they want to engage with you. But first, maybe their own anxiety is too high, that if you're responding at every point, it takes them out of their own therapeutic process. And that's okay. And then always checking in with clients about attrition. So what's getting in the way of us moving forward? Is there anything that I said or did that isn't consistent with what's important to you? Is there anything that maybe I should be aware of moving forward? Anything that happened or didn't happen? Is there a place you were hoping to get today and we didn't get there, but maybe we could begin there next week? Talk to clients about what it feels like to not want to come to therapy. Anybody who's been in therapy for any period of time have had those days where you don't want to go see your therapist. I've been there. And oftentimes it's you. Often. I mean, sometimes it's them, but many times it's an internal process. So maybe it is, I'm embarrassed what I just told you about, or I see where we're going in therapy and I don't really feel like going there right now, so I'm gonna have a headache and I'm gonna miss today's session, or whatever it is. And sometimes it's something you can change, sometimes it's not. But it's important to have those conversations with the client, because at the end of the day, if they're not showing up, there's no amount of clinical skill that can kind of take you over that crest. Does anyone else have any thoughts or suggestions on how to take that negative feedback and kind of respond to the client from that non-judgmental stance and implement it into your practice? Okay. So what do you do with feedback? If you are seeing a meaningful clinical or therapeutic change, if you're noticing a remission in symptoms, if you're noticing like an increase in values consistent living or behavioral activation, if If things seem to be going in the right direction and the client is in agreement that things are going in the right direction, don't change anything. You're on the right track. Good, bully for you. Keep doing what you're doing. And as long as that like rate of change is kind of that steep incline, that curve where it's going up, 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 leave things as they are. Now, if you notice that that slope is kind of evening out, maybe it's time to change the rate of treatment. So maybe instead of having therapy every week, you want to shift to therapy every other week. Or the inverse of that is maybe they are stuck in so many crises of the week that having 2 sessions a week would increase that rate of change again. There's no one right answer. I would encourage you to consult with either your clinical supervisor or clinical consultant for whatever your program is. But start kind of exploring that and seeing like, okay, I had one client that I've worked with pretty recently that we were doing 2 sessions a week, and one session was very much devoted to his trauma narrative, while the other we devoted to his crises of the week. So we were doing cognitive processing therapy once a week in one session. And then the second session each week were devoted to just kind of he had a lot of interpersonal, like tumultuous interpersonal relationships, a lots of ups and downs within his romantic partnerships and parenting woes. He just, every week there was a new crisis that needed to be addressed. And it was sidetracking us from our ability to work on his trauma history. And unfortunately, many of his crises were tied very directly to his trauma history. So if we can address this, it will alleviate that, but we can't do that because these keep getting in the way. So we started setting some boundaries. So our Monday session, trauma work. Our Thursday session, crisis of the week work. And that if, and what he sort of started to realize, which is what you and I probably already know to be true, is that many of these crises of the week weren't truly crises, but distractions from the trauma work. So the longer we went on with that, and we had those sort of very clear, distinct boundaries surrounding how we were going to spend each of our time together, it turned out he was much better at independently navigating those crises of the week than he was giving himself credit for. Remember, a big part of our job, and those of you who are TSSs, you're probably pretty familiar with this, but it's our job to work ourselves out of a job. We don't want clients to be dependent on us long term. We want to transfer the skills and get out. And sometimes that involves teaching our clients that they really, truly can do it on their own. You see clients for as long as there's meaningful change and they want to continue. Some clients have that meaningful change ongoing, or different phases of life will stir up different things. So people come in and out of therapy at different stages. And then use your feedback or your fit scores to determine which cases, clients, etc., you are going to discuss within a treatment setting. I'm sorry, within a supervision setting. So if you have clients that are consistently giving you high scores, don't bring those clients to your supervision. I've been a supervisor now long enough that I know that it is very tempting as a supervisee to engage in positive presentation management. And I've been a supervisee to engage in positive presentation management. And you like to bring those things into the room that you think you're doing really well. And you kind of like to show, like come in and show your work to the teacher and get that gold star. And that's great. That's an important use of your time for sure. But it shouldn't be all of your supervision. So bring in your gold star and then say, all right, and this client hates me. So can we talk about that for a minute? Bring in the clients that are giving you those lower scores. Bring in those clients that are the highest risk for attrition, and start to kind of look at your clinical work with that individual and see if you can shift gears a little bit to see if you can do things a little bit better. Oh no, your client doesn't like you enough that now they want a new therapist. Wah, wah. While that will be a massive bummer at first, it hurts. I'm not a big crier, just generally. I'm not somebody who cries rather frequently. Not that I never cry, I just don't frequently cry. But I remember like one of my hardest and most embarrassing moments in graduate school was when a very borderline client called me up after our work together and fired me in an extremely borderline way in the middle of the office. And I was fine on the phone, but after I got off the phone, I remember just walking into the client or the clinician waiting area and just sobbing, big, ugly tears because they were that mean to me. And that's okay. It's okay to hurt. It's okay when it doesn't feel good. And it's okay even when it's the client's own like potential personality pathology. Sometimes it strikes home. And I will tell you, clients that are higher on some of those personality characteristics also tend to be the best at giving you really harsh, critical, painful feedback. They're very good at kind of casing you out. They're good at reading their environment. They're good at attending to the people within the room and kind of getting a beat on everybody. And I would say that those clients also are really good at knowing exactly what to say to hurt your feelings, and they frequently say it, just to kind of poke at that button. So if it happens, that's okay. It's okay to feel sad. It's okay to hurt. It's okay to mourn the loss of a relationship that was important to you. It's okay to fall back and realize and kind of sit with the notion that you weren't the best in this particular situation, or you did screw up. It's okay to be embarrassed by that. What's not okay is to sit with it and hold that entirely to yourself. Take that to your supervision. Take that to your consultation. Take that to a trusted colleague and say, listen, I worked really hard with this client. I tried really hard. I was imperfect. And hindsight is always 20/20. If you take any of your clinical cases, whether they be a success or whether it be a failure, success, failure, I put that all in quotes because I don't necessarily believe anything's quite that categorical. But whether you would consider a client's discharge a success or a failure, if you sit and look at everything you said, everything you did, every intervention you implemented, I would argue that you screwed up in both of those instances. In your successful discharges, you made mistakes. In your unsuccessful discharges, you made mistakes. Your outcomes and your mistakes likely aren't as critical to the eventual outcome as you may give them credit. There are a lot of other pieces. There are a lot of other factors. Learn from those mistakes, reframe your failure. I promise that clinically and therapeutically, that's where you're going to learn the most about honing your skill and practicing your art. I would say that most of us as clinicians never really enter in and say that they arrive. I remember when I first got my license, the first license that was ever awarded to me was that of a licensed psychologist. And I remember getting it in the mail and thinking, like, they must not know. This must be some sort of mistake. People should still watch me. I shouldn't be able to practice independently. I've seemed to have pulled off this massive sneak attack that no one can see me for what I truly am. And I think that that imposter syndrome is so common within the clinical realm. I think as clinicians who wish and intend to do well and be helpful and make positive impacts on our clients, it's easy to kind of fall into that trap of thinking, oh, geez, this person would be so much better off if they were assigned to anyone's caseload but mine. But here's what it is. At the end of the day, they're on your caseload. And at the end of the day, you are responsible for giving them the single best provision of service you are capable of. And just like the research from years ago, I think it came out of the 70s, showed up with this concept of good enough parenting, there's something called good enough therapy. And good enough therapy involves treating that individual with dignity and respect, showing up and maintaining the therapeutic frame. You are on time. You've behaved ethically. You've connected to that client. You've worked outside of the therapy room by practicing and engaging in research and ensuring that you're doing what you need to do to be the best version of yourself. And sometimes you've got to hang your hat on that. You've got to be mindful of that. So if a client comes to you and says, hey, I'm not digging this, can I have a new therapist? Take off your armor, sort of drop the rope and lean in from a non-judgmental stance and say, so what, in my effort to reassign you to a new clinician that's going to be more effective to your needs, what are you looking for from the therapeutic relationship that you might not be getting with me? Apologize, even even if you don't feel like you're at fault, I think it's important to kind of lean in and show them, thank them for their feedback, thank them for giving you that information, because it took guts. I mean, even if they're just doing it to be a jerk, it took guts. So you want to thank them for that opportunity to have that conversation with them. And you're going to have the experience where a client just disappears. They vote with their feet. And I promise that's usually more challenging or more difficult to digest than actually knowing what happened to the therapeutic relationship. So apologize and emphasize that your ultimate goal is helping the client, and you're willing to do what it takes to make that happen. If the rupture is impossible to repair, make a referral. But there are times where the rupture is not impossible to repair. There are times where simply seeking to repair the rupture repairs the rupture and improves the therapeutic relationship, and you go on to do excellent therapeutic work. I had a client once that I was working with who a couple weeks into our work together, I hadn't seen her very long, maybe 3 or 4 sessions, not a lot. And it's funny, I can't even remember this client's name anymore, but I remember her story and what she looked like. And so she came into the room one day and she said, "Hey, I'm feeling not great about our connection. Would you be willing to transfer me to a different clinician?" And I was kind of, this person felt really reserved. Like, I didn't feel super connected to them either, but I was kind of at that point in time blaming the client versus ever looking at myself, right? Because that's easier and that's preferred and much more comfortable. And so as I entered into that conversation, as I took off my armor, as I leaned in and said, "Hey, what's sort of the rationale behind your referral?" She mentioned that she was a transfer to me. So her clinician had left, so I ended up with her. And she was a transfer to me, and she had been in therapy previously for quite some time. And so as I unpacked the referral and kind of started to look at that, she said, "Well, last week you asked me about my family history, because I like to get a bit of a lifeline or timeline to kind of understand. And I had known that her father was murdered when she was younger. And I knew that was a part of her story, but I like to hear people's stories from them. I'm not usually a super big fan of just reading all the notes and then kind of taking that as gospel. One, because it involves the previous therapist not putting any of their own filters on their clinical documentation, and that's just impossible. And then two, I care much less about the content of one story and care much more about the process of one story. And in this client sort of telling me, at the time, she told me her narrative, and we talked about the death of her father and what that was like for her. She was very young. She wasn't present at the time that he was murdered. But in telling me this story, she told it like she was telling me a weather report. There was no real affect throughout the course of the story until she got to telling me about the woman who discovered her father, a complete stranger, discovered her father, called 911 and sat with him and held his hand as he died. And then she just wept. She just wept for this woman. She wept for the process. And when she asked me for the transfer, the next session, she said, I was angry because I know that must be in my chart. I know that my story about my dad has to have been written down. And it bothers me that you didn't bother to read my chart. And that you're making me come in here and just retell you, like, stir up all these old wounds. And if you had just read, I wouldn't have had to do that. And I get that, you know what I mean? I can understand on one level why that would be important to her, especially because I didn't give the rationale, the clinical rationale as to why it was important to me. And so I apologized. I took responsibility for not, because what she took from that is I didn't care enough about her to read her chart. It wasn't that I didn't read the chart. It's that I didn't care enough to prepare for our time together. And so I sort of zoomed back a little bit. I apologized for that. And I told her kind of my rationale. It wasn't that I didn't read the chart. I was aware of her father's being deceased, but that I always like to hear things from people. I like to hear people's stories in their own words and with their own language. And I care much, much more about how somebody says something than what they say. It's why text messaging has a tendency to be a problem in romantic relationships, and why Text therapy is something you'll never see me move towards here at PCS, because I think there's so much lost within the therapy room. So sometimes your clients don't get better, or only get marginally better. Sometimes we are working with our clients to prevent them from getting worse. Sometimes monitoring progress and having vital conversations keeps everybody honest. And sometimes assessing progress with the client is imperative to success to explore alternative options. But all of that involves a certain sense of ego strength, like a certain sense of comfort and a willingness to be personally vulnerable within the therapeutic work that we do. So the most effective therapists will give themselves the benefit of doubt, not the benefit of doubt, but the benefit of doubt. So recognizing we're all imperfect. We're all turkeys in the same turkey soup, kind of striving towards being better in what we do. Nobody likes a cocky therapist. Nobody likes a judgy therapist. If you come in with an arrogance to you or this perception that you're infallible, that's not going to be exceptionally beneficial to the therapeutic process overall. It's important that we connect with our clients for successful outcomes and engage in deliberate practice. Obviously, PCS has a number of pieces and components built into many of our clinical programs that have heavy training emphasis. So an outpatient, we have 10 trainings that anybody needs to go through to successfully graduate from startup. And family-based, and a heavy amount of your work is spent engaging in training hours. In IBHS, you have layers of different supervision in group and individual. And I would argue that even outside of that, if you want to be the best version of yourself clinically, you need to seek out additional resources and trainings and YouTube videos and read books and do all of those different things that are really going to take you closer to your goal to be of being the best clinician possible. So one of the issues that we run into is that most people think they are better at what they do than they actually are. So if you do research, about 80% of individuals think they are above average drivers. Statistically, that's not possible. 80% of people cannot be above average. Only 49% of people can be above average. 49% of therapists are below average in their skill set. That doesn't mean that they're inadequate, but usually competence is unrelated to confidence, which is interesting. You would think these two things overlap. But some of the most competent clinicians I've worked with lack competence in their skills. And some of the most incompetent clinicians I've ever known are very confident in their incompetence. It's kind of scary. So don't get cocky. No matter how long you're in this world, there's always stuff you don't know. There's always areas where you can grow. There's always things you've never heard of. I've done the trauma training. I do trauma training every 10 weeks and have for the last 4 or 5 years. I do the exact same training over and over again. Last week when I did it, somebody told me about a specific trauma theory I've never heard of. And I wrote it down and I've since researched it. It's very interesting. I hope to implement it into my trauma training. But listen, we only get there if we are flexible enough to listen and hear and kind of fall back and be like, wow, I've never heard of that before. Please tell me more. Maintain a healthy level of professional self-doubt. So you don't want to have so much self-doubt that you're almost paralyzed in your own fear of doing anything. And you don't want to have so little self-doubt that you think that you've arrived and there's no way that you can further improve. You've got to find that secret place in the middle. And use reliable and valid feedback to augment your clinical judgment. Our clinical judgment is not infallible. I have worked with clients that I was too close to, and I didn't see something. I missed something along the way because I either bought into a story that they were selling, or I failed to attend to some of the other pieces or components of what they were doing. So 97% of outcome variability and therapeutic success is directly attributable to therapist variability within the therapeutic relationship. So we really are driving the bus. Our ability to connect to people. It's not our client's job to connect to us. We don't put that on them. It is our job to connect to them. They might not like us. They might tell us they don't like us. But it's our job to kind of lean in and see if we can overcome that. The ability to connect with a broad base of complex clients is important. So I'm not saying I'll only help you if you fit into my box of therapy clients that I can work with. No, that's ridiculous. And you sound like a jerk if you say it that way. It's our job to connect to our clients. That's part of like a fundamental part of our job description. So if we call a client and they don't call us back, it's our job to call them again. It's not our job to take it personally or, well, I'm not going to call them until they call me. That's ridiculous. You sound ridiculous if you say that. It's our job to reach out and connect. That is our cross to bear. We have to be willing to look at therapist factors that either get in the way or foster a higher level of clinical connection. So fall back and look at your own pieces in your own parts and what's getting in the way. You will notice that there are certain types of clients that you will struggle to connect to. You will notice there are certain types of therapeutic content that are difficult for you to navigate. That doesn't mean you can never. It doesn't mean you shouldn't. It means you need to look at it. It means you might want to take that to your own individual therapy. It means you should definitely discuss it with a trusted colleague or a supervisor to kind of explore that, wrestle with it, and see if you can find a better way to carry that moving forward. The top performing clinicians approach the subject of improving their outcomes in a way that is slow but steady. So compared to the average therapist, the best therapists, what the term has been coined for them, super shrinks. The super shrinks spend anywhere between 2.5 and 4.5 more hours per week outside of working hours on activities specifically designed to increase their own efficacy in their work. So whether they are seeking extra workshops, training videos, readings, supervision, the best clinicians are the ones that say, I'm going to take my time outside of work and put my energy into that. Now, I would argue that there are some other factors that exist within these super shrinks. And I think some of it is a genuine sense of curiosity, a genuine interest in better understanding the fundamental human condition. And I don't know that they all engage in that deliberate practice in an effort to be a better clinician, but they engage in that deliberate practice because it's interesting to them, because they want to, because the act of growing and engaging in that way actually feeds something for them. And so I would encourage you to find the things that kind of feed your passion in that area. So maybe right now you're a TSS, but your heart and your goal long-term would be to be a drug and alcohol therapist. Then I would really read anything by Claudia Black, look up things by Kelly Wilson, lean into the best, the top addictions clinicians in our field and study them and research them and explore that. Let's say right now you're an outpatient, but you think gosh, I would love to be in family-based. Then look at family system stuff and read any work by Salvador Minuchin and Virginia Satir and start looking at family work and what that looks like and what that means. It doesn't mean that what you research or what you're exploring needs to be directly related to your clinical interest or your clinical role, but it's sort of that long-term successive approximations towards your goal, and that's sort of what differentiates the average therapist from the super shrink. FIT works for everyone. All of the research with all of the people suggests that FIT is pretty effective. So FIT is effective for mandated clients. FIT is effective for kiddos on the autism spectrum. FIT is effective for families and couples and groups. And so literally any piece of research that's looked at systematically exploring and eliciting feedback from clients to engage in a better therapeutic relationship, the research shows us exponentially increases and improves your client outcomes. So if you know Carl, you know that it's going to be okay. It's hard. It's hard to get feedback. It's hard to explore feedback. It's hard to look at those parts of ourselves, but I promise it's going to be okay. So we here at PCS do fit a little bit different than perhaps it's been operationalized anywhere else, maybe in the world. And that's okay. What we found is that when we saw it, so we brought Scott Miller in, he's brilliant. Our clinicians are all like, he's great. I love what he's selling. But I'm not going to use a ruler. So the ruler was really a deal breaker for a lot of our staff. So we fell back and we explored what we could do better. We reached out to our staff and we asked them to give us information about every single type of question that they would like to ask their clients. And over time, we came up with 2 specific domains, connection and workability. We also found that doing fit at the end of the session was a problem for a couple of different reasons. The first is that if you left 5 minutes for it at the end of session and the client was like, yeah, everything's good, I have no feedback, then you had to be like, oh, well, tell me more about your mother. Like you had to kind of fall back because you didn't want to commit fraud, but you didn't want to downbill. So you had to find a way to finish and fulfill the rest of the session time. What we also found is that if there was a problem, 5 minutes isn't enough time to address it. So now the client is saying, I don't like you and I'm not coming back next week. And I have another client in 8 minutes and I now have to somehow find this way to repair this deep therapeutic rupture. It's just too much pressure. So what we do at PCS is we use FIT, or we use the eye care assessment at the beginning of the following session. And we found that's much more effective. An unintended consequence that we found has been really helpful is to do at the beginning of the following session is it serves as a bridge between the therapy sessions. Each session should not exist in isolation. They should build upon each other. They should progress through each other. And so what we found is sometimes clients were being like, oh, I don't even remember last session. Well, that's a freaking problem. You need to be able to remember what happened in the last session to build on what happened in the last session. So it caused both client and clinician to fall back and be a little bit more intentional in reviewing the last session and moving forward. So the benefits were kind of twofold. We developed this measure called the eye care assessment. We have it in both English and Spanish, and we have it for both kids and adults. It is in the EMR system. So if you click on that little drop-down arrow next to the client's name and scroll down to the eye care assessment, you can then select the adult or child version. Really easy to administer. It pops up, it looks like this. It has that little the introductory paragraph there at the top, but you can also introduce it with your own language, and I would strongly encourage you to do so. And then the client will click and give you feedback. But let's say you have a Spanish speaking client. That's great. Click the translate to Spanish button up here in the top. Then the client can click and make a different decision. Then once you hit submit, the screen pops up and you automatically see how things are going. You see the different points in which the feedback, the fit measure was administered, and you can start to see some trends. So if this was my particular client, it looks like they feel pretty good about the way therapy's going, right? They're saying, my progress in therapy, I feel pretty positively, but what happened in our last session that all of a sudden there's been a rupture within our relationship? Now it's important to kind of lean back and explore with the client. So what happened that we went from very positive to somewhat negative? I think that's an important thing to kind of explore with the client and think about. And it might be like, well, I felt like it was invalidating, or maybe you were late, or maybe they didn't like your shoes. I don't know, but it's important for you to talk to the client about it and see if you can repair it now versus later. Because what we know from the research is that 3 negative scores on that connection score, you're much less likely to ever see that client again. If you get 3 consistent bad ratings, that client is much more likely to vote with their feet, peace out, you're never going to see them again. And now you're left wondering whatever happened within that therapeutic relationship. So it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to look at a graph and be like, yikes. but to lean in and say, hey, I'm noticing that on our connection score, it went down a little bit from last week. Would you be willing to give me any more information or help me understand a little bit better what shifted within our relationship, so that I can seek to improve that moving forward? And maybe it is like, you wear red and I really hate red. And then wear red or don't wear red. I don't know. That's a stupid reason to not like somebody. So maybe that's important to process with the client. But maybe it is, I felt like you cut me off too much, or I didn't like your metaphor, or I felt like you didn't understand me. And then I think that's really important to repair. Also, we're modeling for the client that you can repair. So we're teaching our clients how to have these difficult interpersonal conversations. I've been in outpatient therapy long enough. I can't think of a single client that at some point in time over the course of our therapy didn't turn to their most important interpersonal relationships and problems in communication and problems in conflict and barriers to intimacy. And I'm sure many of you have had times within your lives where your important interpersonal relationships kind of got in the way. So I challenge you to lean in and have these difficult, crucial, important conversations with our clients, also in an effort to kind of teach them or train them or support them in learning to how to best have these conversations with our client, with the people that are most important to them in their lives. So it's important for people here at PCS that use the eye care to know how it will be used. The eye care will be used to inform treatment. It's used to support clinicians. It's used to assist clients in articulating their needs. It's used to help clinical supervisors guide their clinical supervision and sort of shift the narrative towards the things that are most important to us. It may be used at some point in a de-identified manner for funding sources. We're seeking to do a little bit of research in the area now that we've used FIT for a while. But yeah, for the most part, it's important for us to kind of fall back and look at FIT. But it's not going to be used at like Casey Lawley. We're not going to go and use just her FIT scores and publish them. That wouldn't be good. It would be done in some sort of de-identified manner to kind of look at outcomes and feedback-informed treatment. How will eye care not be used here at PCS? I feel like that's just important to understand, is understanding how it will be used. It will not be used to determine bonuses. It will not be used for retention. It will not be used to determine who gets what office. It will not be used to determine how much PTO you get, and it will not be used in a disciplinary way. This is a tool. We are not using this to have any sort of punishments or consequences. There is no reason to don a tinfoil hat and engage in a conspiracy theory that somehow eye care will be utilized to harm our clinicians in any way. It truly is a tool that is non-evaluative in nature, nor will it ever be used in an evaluative fashion. And we are very mindful as a leadership team to never allow that. So what questions do you all have? What pieces of information or what barriers do you all see to the ability to kind of drop your guard, fall down, and engage in positive feedback-informed treatment? Realizing we have a little bit more time left than I want to. So I do have a video to fill some time if we need to, but what questions do y'all have? Nothing, nada? Okay, then I will pull up that clip.
Hey, this is Scott Miller. Welcome to my top performance blog. I have the pleasure this week of speaking with
No, this isn't the right one. Dang it.
is an
I
internationally
need to do a better
known
job
author
preparing
and
these videos.
trainer,
Sorry, y'all.
especially in the field of human.
That was a funny little post though about like, nope, not gonna be alone with my thoughts. I'm just gonna bake bread.
I also tried to bake bread, ironically, and I was terrible at it. I was terrible at it. It was so bad. I tried 3 different times. I live right by Trogues Brewery, and they were selling the sourdough starter, and I was like, surely I'll bake bread. And then I saw that, and I don't bake anything. So yeah, obviously. It is unique when we are so uncomfortable with our own internal process that we like to do some pretty crazy stuff, like bread baking. All right, here we are.
Hi, this is Scott Miller. Welcome to my top performance vlog. I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Heidi Bratland from Norway. And Heidi, it's been almost 1 year to the date that I last spoke with you.
Yeah.
And at that time, you had finished up a study on implementing FIT in a hospital-based mental health clinic. Can we just go back and review just a bit, because your work actually is having quite an impact. What you did originally is, I feel like, one of the most important studies on FIT so far, which is to separate the ideas of doing feedback-informed care from its actual implementation in the clinical context, which are, as your data show, 2 very different things. Can you just tell us a little bit about the setting again and what you found in that original study?
Sure. So this is a hospital-based outpatient clinic, and it's a general clinic, so it serves all kinds of different diagnoses, but people would generally be quite severely impaired to be allowed in. And we started implementing FIT, and then at the same time we started doing the study, more or less at the same time. So we compared treatment with FIT to treatment without FIT. And in the beginning we had no idea what we were doing. We didn't know really how to do it. And you know this because you trained us, right?
Yeah.
And it's very naive. We had absolutely no idea. And so it took us 4 years to collect all the data that we needed to do a fair comparison. And so when we started analyzing the data, we did find that clients who had been treated with FIT benefited more from treatment than those who had been treated without. But we were kind of surprised that the effect size was not larger than it actually was. So there was a significant effect, but it wasn't super large.
Right.
Yeah. So we started looking into that, and we said, well, if we could do the study over again now, we would have a much larger effect because now we actually know how to use them. We use OS and SRS. As I said, we had no idea in the beginning. And so we wanted to look at whether the effect changed over time. So the clients who were included in the very beginning of the study would benefit less from FIT than those who were recruited and included towards the end of those 4 years. And that's exactly what we found.
Right.
Which makes a lot of sense.
In terms of implementation science, it makes sense as well. But you say you didn't know what you were doing to FIT, and then eventually in time you feel like you managed to get better. When I'm out and I'm providing training, I think many people see the 2 measures, 4 items apiece, and you have this fancy automated programs. If you like it, it presents beautiful graphs, and what the hell's so hard to learn about this? Let's just set it in place. How do you know that it was difficult? What tells you know more about it now as opposed to then?
Well, I think to me, one of the main challenges with working with FIT is that it tells you whether you're being helpful to the client or not. But it doesn't really tell you what to do if you're not being helpful. And that's the main thing that we were working on in that implementation process. So in the beginning, it also had to do with attitudes. We had to take it seriously. We had to work at taking the measures seriously, the information seriously, and say that, well, I'm actually not being helpful. It's not just a measurement error, or the client is more in touch with their feelings, so it doesn't really matter if their functioning is not better than in the beginning, right? So we needed to work first at accepting that if the ORS graph is not showing improvement, then probably there is no improvement. That was a big kind of something that we had to accept. So we didn't really believe that our clients would improve early in therapy. So you know that the ETR, the way it's set up with early, you know, it's kind of, yeah. And we didn't believe in that. We thought that our clients, no, seriously, I mean, you kept telling us, but we didn't believe it. We said, well, we work with personality disorders and psychotic patients, so they're not going to improve that early. It's going to take more time, and we spend a lot of time doing an assessment in the beginning before we start therapy. So we can't really expect that. And also, some people need to get worse before they get better. So we were talking to you on Skype, and you kept repeating that, you know, early improvement is a strong predictor of therapy outcomes. And we were like, yeah, sure, Scott. It's probably true for American college students, but not our group of people, right?
Right.
Did I tell you this? Then I went in and got out all the finished therapies that we had at the time. I think it was about 160. And then I looked at what session could we see improvement in. At what session did we have a green score, you know, about the ATR, and I found that I think about 80% had improvement within the first 5 sessions. About 50% from session 1 to session 2 of those that ever, you know, scored higher, significantly higher than the first session. And then the group that had early improvement within the first 5 sessions, I think they were about 8.5 times more likely to end up benefiting at the end of treatment. So that was very strong, and that was a really important step in our implementation process. So this is not something I publish, but I keep telling it to people when I train them because it's so interesting. It's kind of close to home.
Was that finding something that pushed people finally into trusting the measures and trusting the predictive algorithms?
Absolutely, yeah. And it's something, when I show it to people, when I give trainings, it has a large impact to them because it's very easy to dismiss studies that have been done, you know, in America or somewhere else with different. It's easy to say that it's not going to be like that with our clients. But these were our clients, so we couldn't dismiss it. Yeah.
And so this second study, can you tell us something about that?
We wanted to try and understand how it works, which is a very important question, I think. Because if we know how it works, we know what to focus on in therapy, and we can work back, you know, it goes back to the question of what to do when we're not being helpful.
And there are certainly, I think, in the present discourse about feedback or routine outcome measurement, there's certainly ideas and assumptions that are being made about how it works. But this is really one of the first and serious studies that has looked at it empirically.
Yeah, I think in terms of theories, there hasn't been done that much work. And we have a couple of feedback theories about how they work, but they're not, I don't think they explain everything. I think the field has been, you know, this was a new intervention, Brown was a new intervention, and people were really enthusiastic about it, and all these different studies were popping out everywhere and showing an effect. And then people didn't really stop to think, what is this? How does it work? What is it? We didn't theorize about it, and we didn't do any research on it. And I think it's time now, especially because they don't seem to always do the trick. It doesn't always seem to work. So we need to know what the effective elements are so that we can make them.
That's right. And if we continue to do the same randomized clinical trial of feedback and no feedback, we're not going to get any further. And secondly, I've noticed there's a tendency to interpret the findings in a very particular way. And that we fit it into our current way of thinking. Well, it works with these types of diagnoses in people, but it doesn't work with these other types of diagnoses in people. And we still really don't have any idea about what's going on in the use of this intervention that makes it work.
Yeah, and what do I do as therapist? When it circles back to the question for me. So I'm with a client and I'm not being helpful. What do I do?
Right.
That's a big question, and that's I feel like I need the answer to that.
Yeah.
It's helpful to me to know if it's not effective with the personality disorder, because I have to have those people as well, right?
Right.
It's not they can select the clients that I work with.
No.
I'm being told that I'm not being helpful by the ORS, and I need to know what to do about it.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. So that's what we wanted to approach in this study, right?
Yes.
That's what I wanted to try and find out. And since the PCOMs or TET emphasizes the alliance so much, so strongly through the SRS, that was a very natural place to start. So we tested the hypothesis that some of the reason why clients who've been treated with FIT benefited more from treatment was that FIT had a good impact on the alliance. That FIT helped therapists improve the alliance over time. That was the hypothesis.
Okay.
And the way that we tested it is, first we looked at whether clients who've been receiving treatment with FIT had more alliance improvement over time.
Yes.
So we were interested in looking at the alliance over time, not just at one point in time, but whether it increased over time or not.
Isn't it amazing that this is kind of a new and novel idea? Because throughout the history of the field, we've been measuring the alliance often at single points of contact and then looking for its impact on outcome. Yes. So you were looking at it in this particular study over time.
Exactly. And I think as most therapists will recognize that the alliances or the therapeutic relationship is not something that's static. It's something that's continuously evolving, and that the change, the development of it really can have quite a large impact on the client.
Yes.
And so the next step then was to look at whether alliance increase over time was associated with better outcomes, so that the clients who had experienced more alliance increase then had better outcomes.
Right.
And that's exactly what we did find. So we found that compared to clients who had been treated without FIT, those who had been treated with FIT experienced more alliance growth over time, over the first 2 months of treatment. So the alliance improved. And we found that the more clients' alliances improved, the better their outcomes.
Wow. Perfect. And the implication of this for that, what do we do with my client's question when treatment isn't working? In your mind, if you take this finding and try to extrapolate and think clinically, what does it mean? We should work at improving the alliance. That's the easiest way of saying it. It's important. It's not important to have a perfect alliance from session 1. In our FIT condition, the alliance was actually worse after the first session with FIT than without. That didn't have anything to say for the outcomes. We checked to see if it meant worse first session alliance meant worse outcomes. It didn't. There was no connection. But the increase over time had a big impact on outcomes. Right. Which, interestingly enough, goes all the way back to some preliminary research that Jeb Brown did back in, I think it was 2009. And then Jesse Owen replicated this in a sample of kids, showing that this improving alliance effect. And then now this particular study that you led has added that FIT, in fact, works in part by a quarter of the effect of it is by improving the alliance between client and therapist.
Yeah, and it's not just finding that's been shown in the context of ROM, but outside of that as well. I mean, there is accumulating evidence that improvement in the alliance from one session to the next precedes improvement in symptoms, right?
Right, exactly.
That first the alliance improves, and then distress. What is the word I'm looking for? Then the symptoms.
Distress follows.
Yeah.
Right.
So it does look like we're approaching an understanding of the alliance as a working mechanism in therapy, which of course is not a new idea. My sense when working with, I'm back in the clinic now, I see 20 clients a week, and it's kind of changed a little bit how I work with it and how I understand and think about it. And I think that to me, the SRS, I think when we did the paper, I thought that it was about the SRS. But now it feels to me as if though it's not really about the SRS, but it's not really about the conversation that I have with the client about the SRS during the last 5 minutes of every session. That's just icing on the cake. It's just a tiny segment of a therapy. But it's something that's kind of attuning me to the topics. It's a constant reminder of the alliance. Both to me,
in your mind all the time.
It's in my mind, yeah. And I think I'm more attuned to it and pay more attention to it throughout the whole session. And I think those are the things that we talk about throughout the whole session. That's probably more important than what we do towards the end.
Yes. It's not about did you get all the goals negotiated collaboratively by the end of the visit, but am I working collaboratively with the client in this moment and the next? And why am I choosing to do that now and not now, so to speak? Making me aware of all of that.
Exactly. So when I do training, people will often ask me, do you have time during those last 5 minutes? What do you do when you get to low SRS score? What do you do about it? And how can you fit that large conversation, which it has to be, within those 5 minutes? And the answer is that you can't. What I encourage people to do when I train them is to just stop the fire. So in the last 5 minutes of the session, the client tells you that I'm not happy with this or that. This is not the time when you start exploring if it has to do with the relationship to their mother. That's not it. You don't have the time. You have a new client coming in 5 minutes. What you do is you say, thank you so much for telling me. And I'm so sorry. And I appreciate the honesty and really, really, really happy you told me.
So Heidi, am I reading your affect correctly here? Because I get kind of and I don't want to ask you to reveal your deepest feelings, but I do get a sense of kind of somehow excitement as you approach these questions.
Yeah. It's funny you should notice that. I'm back in the clinic now. I've been doing my PhD for 4 years and I've been out of the clinic, and it's a lot more exciting to be back than I thought it would be. I really love working with the clients and I have a lot of fun doing it. And I definitely think that fits has something to do with it. It gives me some kind of a security that if I make a mistake, I will have the opportunity to fix it again, to make it right. So I think it's making me a little bit more playful, maybe with the clients, that I can take more chances or try out things that I'm not sure is going to work, because I feel confident that if it's a really bad idea, either the client will tell me or I will notice that they're getting worse and then I can change. So I think, yeah. So I think my affect right. I am enthusiastic about clinical work, and it's the work. It's not about the measures. It's not about the measures. It's about meeting people and helping them change. It's an incredibly rewarding work that we do, and the measures is just something that we do in the beginning and the end of every session. That's kind of keeping us on track, but it's not really about the measures.
It isn't, right? and the measures aren't the work. That's exactly right. And when I say that, people get very confused. Are we not supposed to use the measures? No, I say use the measures. Use the measures. Because it inspires in them the same thing I'm seeing in you, which is a tolerance of even yourself. You can try new things. You can do some things, and an awareness that mistakes will be made. And the uncertainties that are just a routine part of the work.
Exactly. Yeah.
Hey, Heidi, thanks so much for talking with me.
My pleasure.
And I look.
There we go. All right. So I thought that she and he sort of together do an excellent job kind of articulating that it really isn't about the measure. It really isn't about the how you do it necessarily. It's mostly about just doing it, leaning in, being willing to demonstrate vulnerability with our clients, being willing to kind of have that uncomfortable conversation in service of the greater good and the client's own growth and development and the directions that they're headed. So before we wrap up here today, realizing that we could probably talk about deliberate practice and intentional client connection for the rest of the day or the week or the month even. But before we wrap up, any comments, questions, concerns, things that we're missing from this training about your own understanding of feedback-informed treatment, anything that I should be aware of moving forward to kind of help people really wrap their head around this particular content area?
I think for myself, I appreciate this topic of the feedback informed treatment, because as I started with my clients early on, I didn't realize how important it was until my clients started no-showing me. So I was trying to figure out, like, why are they no-showing me? Why am I not getting anything and hearing anything about, like, what am I doing or what can I do better to help serve them? Because I thought I was doing, like, pretty good, but apparently that was not what they were getting. So just with that fact of, I think for me, I've been reflecting, like, I would prefer to receive negative feedback rather than no feedback at all, just to learn.
And like those no-shows or like the clients that just drop out and we never see again, like that's feedback. And in my opinion, harder feedback to take than having the conversation. Like the conversation might kind of suck, but having a client that you kind of care about and are connected to and just have them disappear and never see them again, that's really hard. I mean, that's hard on a human level. You just are connected to and value this person, and to have them just kind of disappear, that's difficult. So it's like a little bit of pain now versus like a lot of pain later. And when presented with those two options, I'll almost always take a little bit of pain now compared to a lot of pain later. Anything else before we wrap up today?
I appreciated how you put in there about when feedback should happen, because I know that in all of my classes throughout school, they've really stressed that you ask for feedback at the end of the session. And it really makes a lot more sense to not do it that way, because you're right. There's absolutely no time to address negative feedback when the session is over. So that makes a lot more sense to me now, to do it in the beginning and to use it as that bridge.
And I will always, like, right around that 40 to 41 minute mark, because I like to do 45-minute sessions. I know the range is 38 to 52, but I feel like for me, 45 is what works. It's what works like strategically throughout the day, and it's just what works clinically. Like, I feel like 45 minutes is enough to do something without maybe trying to stretch. So right around that 41 minute mark, if we're at a good stopping point, I'll usually say, like, is there anything left like before we wrap up today, is there anything that's left unsaid? Is there anything I need to hear? Is there anything else going on? But I really focus on like the feedback at the beginning of the next session and use it as the bridge, and then also really use it as a way to get an understanding of the therapeutic relationship and kind of see what's getting in the way. But I'll do the check-in at the end, but then I do like the feedback informed treatment at the beginning. So, I mean, I guess I sandwich it, but where I really like lean in and work to have that grittier conversation is to start there versus end there. Anything else before we wrap up today? All right, then. Thank you all for your time and attention today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, an excellent weekend. It's supposed to be sunny and beautiful, so get outside and enjoy it, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you. You can.